Welcome to Success Weekly with James Tharris, a weekly dose of thought-provoking ideas and helpful tips on improving your mindset. And now, here's your host, James Tharris.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Success Weekly. I'm James Tharris, your host. Listen, if you've listened to some of my podcasts in the past, then you know just how much I am of how much of a stickler I am about reading. You know, it's my opinion that leaders are readers, and I think that if you were to take a poll from the world's most successful people, and when I'm speaking about successful people, I don't just mean millionaires and billionaires, although they're certainly included in that lot, but anybody who's successful in virtually anything, you're going to find that they have a very strong propensity for learning. And one of the very best ways of learning is learning from other people. And that can be people who are living today or people that are no longer living with us. Some of the most popular books ever written were written by people long ago. And it's important that we as human beings learn how to absorb the wisdom of the past and learn how to absorb the wisdom of other people. And there's a reason why certain books become bestsellers and they get passed around and they continue to be recommended for years and years and years. And I'm going to take a chapter out of a book here that's one of my favorites. I remember when I first read it, it was a very difficult read for me because when I started reading, I didn't enjoy reading. But I read this book because it was on a list. It was on somebody's recommended reading list. It was a very strong recommendation. So I decided, I really want to grow and I want to learn and I want to succeed. And this person that is telling me to read this book is far more successful than I am, and maybe he knows a few things that I don't know. So I'm just going to take him on his word, and I'm going to listen to his advice, and whatever books he recommends, I'm just going to buy them and read them, regardless of whether I think that I need to or I'm going to enjoy it or what have you. And I remember getting into this book. It was one of the first books that I had read that was kind of like a technical how-to, dry book that didn't have a lot of colorful stories. So I didn't like reading a lot, but there were certain times where I really enjoyed reading, and I got into books because they were in a story format and they were very entertaining. And I didn't find this book very entertaining, but boy, did I highlighted the heck out of it as I read it. And each time I read a book, I'll use a different color highlighter, and I usually end up highlighting a lot more on the third or fourth reading. Sometimes even on the second reading, I'll highlight twice or three times as much, and even highlight over some of the things that I've read in the past. So that's kind of a tip I'd like to give to you today, is to really think about, what are you putting into your brain? Are you feeding your mind with positive, uplifting, educational material that can help improve your life? And if not, it's never too late to start. So this is a book called Psycho-Cybernetics by a guy named Maxwell Maltz. I'm not even sure if this particular issue, which is the first issue, is available anymore. Let me see if I can find out when this thing was written. It was written copyright 1960. And so that's probably right about the time. Sometimes they have various dates in there as they do reprints and things. I know that it was purchased by a guy named Dan S. Kennedy, and it was kind of written. It was written with his thoughts included. It was kind of an updated version, and that's also a great book, and in some ways it's a superior book. But there's just something to be said for the original. So he bought the rights to the book because it was that powerful to him, and he wasn't even the first guy that told me about reading this book to begin with. It wasn't until years later, until I got around Dan Kennedy and learned that he had rewritten this book, that I even bought that second book to see what he had added to it. So nonetheless, this is an excellent book for somebody who's trying to improve just their overall success in life, and that always begins with our thinking. So if you look at where you're at in life, you can always trace it a line back to how you think. What was your thinking at that particular time? If you got yourself into trouble like I did as a young child, as a kid, or even a teenager, you can always trace, especially if you're not doing that anymore. Like I'm not. I don't get myself into trouble like that anymore, but back then I did. And at the time, I always thought it was somebody else's fault. I was somebody else's problem. They had a problem with me. And really what it turned out to be was I had a problem with everybody else, and therefore I attracted a lot of situations that really didn't need to happen. And so until I started reading books like this, I wasn't able to pinpoint the problems that I was creating in my life by my thought processes and my habits. And this the very first chapter here is on self-image, and I'm just going to read a couple of the highlights that I've done throughout this book, and maybe comment on them a little bit. But I want to read this first one here. It says, all actions, feelings, behavior, even your abilities are always consistent with your self-image. It says the man who conceives himself to be a failure type person will find some way to fail in spite of all his good intentions or his willpower, even if the opportunity is literally dumped in his lap. Now, this is very, very important, because I think this really kind of encapsulates a lot of people. A lot of people have this situation, and they always think to themselves, well, I'm not good enough. I shouldn't be able to have this. And you know, this was kind of a weird anomaly in my life, and I don't know how to handle it. And that really happens because we don't expect that we're going to succeed sometimes, or we don't think that we deserve certain things in life or certain types of success, and so we question as why we got it, and we don't think that it was, you know, really the right thing. And if our self-image tells us that we don't deserve these things, we often will. And I know I've found myself doing this, you know, in life, and even recently, you know, it's not something that once you fix it, it's fixed forever. You have to go back and continually exercise it, just like a muscle. I mean, you can go into a gym and pump up and lose all kinds of weight and get ripped, but if you stop doing those things, it's not going to be long before you're overweight again and your muscles are flabby and you can't do the same kind of lift the same amount of weights. You know, your self-image is the same way, and you've got to constantly guard it. You've got to constantly build it and fortify it, and that's what reading does. It really, especially if you read books like this. As I said before, this is not like a storybook, one of those, you know, exciting, heartwarming stories, but it's going to tell you, it's going to point out flaws that you might have and not realize that you've had them. And, you know, it's kind of like anything else in life. You really can't fix something in your life until you first know what's wrong. And that's sometimes our self-image protects. It's like a protection mechanism that our brain has, and we want to protect our self-image by, you know, not setting too big of goals and maybe not trying too hard, because what if we fail? What if you know, it's kind of like that character George McFly from Back to the Future, and he says something to the effect to his son Marty, you know, I don't know if I can handle rejection. I just don't think I can take that kind of rejection. And that was kind of his the theme that he had throughout the movie. And then Marty, his son, you know, was basically trying to convince him otherwise and get him to think, you know, bigger and better. And basically he was trying to work on his father's self-image, because he could see how it affected him later in life. You know, being that he came from 1985 and went back to whatever it was 1955, he could see the reason why his father was still the way he was in 1985, and then he wanted to be able to go back and help his father, and which he did. And he actually, I remember him catching himself saying the very same things that he caught his father saying, and thinking to himself, wow, where did that come from? And then realizing, oh, I learned that by hearing my father say it. So he went to fix his father, and then when he came back to 1985, everything had changed, and his father was suddenly successful, and this big bully named Biff that was picking on him and making him feel bad and insecure about himself ended up turning it out to his like, I don't know if he was his butler or something, but he ended up working for him. And, you know, it kind of the tables got turned. And that was all based on George McFly's turn of his self-image, going from not thinking very highly of himself to really believing in himself. And I think he had written a book and all those kind of things. And so, I mean, it really kind of takes a little bit of self-esteem and confidence in yourself to write a book, don't you think? And so maybe that's something that you, as a listener of this podcast, can set as a goal for yourself. Write a book. You know, I've written several books, and I'm not bragging about that. I'm just telling you, if I've done it, you certainly can do it too. And it's just a matter of having the confidence to sit down and write, you know, a few hundred words per day until you end up with a chapter. And then when you end up with a chapter, you get a little momentum, and maybe that chapter, you know, turns into 2 chapters, and maybe it turns into 3 chapters. And pretty soon, you know, if you just keep at it, it turns into a book. And, you know, it might be a book about, you know, something that you've accomplished in your life. It could be a book about, for me, it was a martial arts book. You know, I accomplished a modicum of success in martial arts. And so some of the things that I really had to dig for and go find the answers to that weren't just readily available in the martial arts. I had to go find them. I felt, why not write a book on that and make the next person's journey that much easier? So for me, that's what it did for me. And it all started with me reading books, so maybe that's something you might do. I guarantee there's something you have a passion for or a knack for or knowledge in that not everybody has, and it could turn out to be a book. Or even if you're not really what you would think of as successful. Do you have kids, and how have your kids turned out? If they've turned out really, really well and you get lots of compliments from other people about your kids, maybe you should be writing a book on parenting. That's something to consider. So anyway, it all comes back to your self-image. Now let me read a couple of other little quotes out of this that I've highlighted. So as I mentioned, when I read with a highlighter and a pen or pencil always. I don't ever read without them, because what if I see that one golden gem that I'm reading and I don't happen to have anything to write with or highlight? Then I miss that. I can't go back to and find it again. And so that's, for me, I don't ever read unless I've got something that I can do that with. Now, there have been occasional times where I have broken that rule. Maybe I'm on an airplane and I'm afraid to ask somebody if they have a pen or something like that. There's always a way that you can find to underline something, and so even for me, taking out a set of keys and underscoring them and leaving a mark under that in the page until I can get back to find my highlighter or a pen. I've done that sometimes as well. So don't let that stop you. Just make sure that you read with the intention of somehow indicating the very important points to you. That you can go back, just like I'm doing now. When I first read this book, I think it was in the highlights that I'm reading were probably from the 1993 or 1994 period of time. And now I can come back to this in 2016, the time of this podcast being recorded, and pull these fantastic gems out of this book without having to reread it right away. So anyway, here's what it says, the next one. It says, a young girl who has an image of herself as the sort of person nobody likes will find indeed that she is avoided at the school dance. She literally invites rejection. Now, isn't that funny? Because I swear to you, I did not read that before I talked about George McFly and the rejection. But it really fits very nicely. It's kind of like a female version of him. Maybe you are guilty of thinking that way about yourself. Maybe you have a friend that's thought that way about themselves, or maybe they're thinking about that way about themselves right now, and you're having a hard time getting through to them on that. That would be a person that you might want to share this podcast with, because it might change their life. But if that's you, this would be a great book for you. I really always come back to the very first book that I really read of this kind, and it's called The Greatest Miracle in the World. And I'll probably reference this book on as many podcasts that I can think about it. It's a very short book, like 108 pages long, and it's in a story format, but it's the same type of book that helps you to work on your self-image and your self-esteem. And really, the self-image, I think that's in this book somewhere, and I don't remember for sure if it's in this book or not, but I'm fairly certain it is. And it's basically, it's paraphrased, it's your self-image isn't determined by how you think of yourself. Your self-image is determined by how you think other people think of you, how you think other people see you. That's how your self-image is formed. So stop for a moment and think to yourself, how do you think other people view you? What do you think they think about you when you leave the room? That's your self-image. And if you want to change it, you've got to start reading things and getting around people that are going to challenge you to think differently and think bigger. And reading is the way to do it. I mean, that's something you may not always have access to a person like that in person on the phone or anything. You might, catch them at the wrong time or what have you, but you can always crack open a book and read it, Let me see. This says, instead of saying, I failed that test, which is factual and descriptive, they conclude, I am a failure. So you see, that's something important to remember for your self-image is you are not your habits, you're not your mistakes. Have you made mistakes in the past? Of course you have. Have I made mistakes in the past? Of course I have. There's no getting around that. But if I view myself as a failure because of those mistakes that I've made, and I've made some big ones, let me tell you, I've made some huge mistakes in my life. But I am not those mistakes. Those mistakes happened. I made them. I decided to do them. I made them, but I learned from them, and I've grown bigger and better because of them. So there are some people that are probably in my life that still judge me based on a decision or two that I've made in my past, even though it was 15, 20, 30, 35 or 40 years ago. They still think that I'm that very same person. And maybe they think that is because they haven't grown any since that time themselves, and they don't see any difference in their own lives, so they think to themselves, well, he must be that same person, so I still judge him the same way. That's why it's important as we, when we're kids, we have a very easy time judging our parents and thinking our parents are lazy or they're no good or they don't know anything or whatever. And then as we get bigger and older and we have life experience, we start coming to an understanding of maybe what our parents were thinking at that time, or maybe what our parents didn't know at that time, maybe why our parent made that choice or that decision at that time. And then we start thinking, wow, I feel really bad now for judging that person or judging my parent or judging my sister or my brother or whoever it was for the decisions they made or the mistakes they made, because now I kind of understand how it happened. And that's something to really keep in mind. Maybe I don't know if you've ever done that, but I certainly did that with my parents and thought, oh man, when I get older, I'm going to do things so much differently. And there are so many times that things have happened, and I go, oh my goodness, I can totally see why my father did that now, or why he thinks that way, or why my mother said what she said, or has that opinion. Man, I can really understand that now. And even if it's something that I don't agree with, it might be a decision they made or an opinion they had. And I totally disagree with it then, and I still totally disagree with it. But at least now I can understand why they may have formed that opinion to begin with. That's very important. That's why it's important to protect your self-image by hanging out with better people, reading better books like this book, Psycho-Cybernetics. And I think, in fact, my next couple of podcasts, maybe I'm just going to continue reading through this book because it's such a powerful read. Now, this book... I know I just got off topic there. I was kind of talking about associating with people and, what you put into your mind, what kind of news do you watch and who do you listen to and what do you think's important? I mean, we just got done with this crazy election cycle in 2016 and man, I thought for sure that I was just going to sit back and relax and let all these, knuckleheads step out and voice their opinion and not be involved in it and not be affected by it. And to a large degree, I wasn't publicly. I don't believe in getting on Facebook and ranting about my favorite political belief or whatever, or dogging somebody else's belief. You must be an idiot if you're going to vote for this person or whatever. I don't think that that's the right place to do it because really you can't change them. If they're thinking that way, they're thinking that way for a reason because of the input that they've gotten from somebody else or someplace else, from a particular news outlet or style of news outlet. But I did find myself after reading some of these things getting really upset, and having some private conversations with family members and friends, and then thinking, wow, and really, because I was doing it in private, really letting my true feelings open, and there were safe places that I could do that. And then I think, 3 days later, after I had a chance to really calm down, after reading some of these posts, it really got me up in arms. And I kind of, the fast texting, typing where you're just really going at it and you're putting all your thoughts down. And I remember my wife saying, you're probably typing something you're going to regret later. And she was right. Fortunately, I did that through a private text with a friend of mine, and we're still friends. And nothing has changed there. He and I both understand each other much better, in fact. But we didn't do it publicly. But still, nonetheless, I regret saying some of the things that I said in this text to him because I did it in the moment of emotional, heightened emotions where I was really upset, and we had some disagreeing thoughts on it, and so it's like now, like, oh man, I wish I hadn't said those things, and he said some things too, and I remember the first thing I said to him is, man, you probably shouldn't be posting that stuff on your Facebook page, and he thanked me for that, and then we opened dialogue, and then I let some things out that I shouldn't let out and whatever, but I forget what I was telling you that about, but nonetheless, if you're going to do those kind of things, do it in private and be careful about who you listen to. That I think that's what I was going at, is be careful who you listen to and what you listen to, because it can shape your worldview. And as guarded as I am about these things, that reading somebody else's posts about these things affected my mind and really grated on me and allowed me to make a decision. Although I made it in a better way than many people do, it still allowed me to open myself and say some things in really in anger, is really, to be honest with you, it's really in anger that I probably wouldn't have said any other time and wouldn't have bothered me any other time. But listening to this other rhetoric and seeing it and viewing other people talk about it and I disagreed with it really got my juices flowing, and I felt like I wanted to speak out, which is what I suspect a lot of people do on Facebook. Unfortunately, if I had done that in public, imagine what kind of catastrophe I could have caused in my family, with my friends, with my students, and people that know me and like me and respect me, and maybe because I have a different political viewpoint than they do, that could be the end of that relationship. And I think that's a huge mistake. And so something that I said, or even something I believed in this particular election cycle, I may change my beliefs upon it in the next 6 months as new information comes to light. And I hear and be influenced by different types of media and different people's opinions and especially people's opinions that I respect highly. If it's somebody I don't really know or don't respect very well, their opinion doesn't mean much to me. But if it's somebody I look up to as a mentor or as a role model, and their opinion is different than mine, then wow, I sometimes I catch myself reevaluating my own personal opinion on that, and then maybe changing my thought on it and go, wow, after hearing from that person, that it makes more sense. Maybe I was a little hasty in my decision or my opinion earlier, and so yeah, I can kind of see where they're coming from, and then my opinion is suddenly changed, even if it's just by a small degree, and that's what happens. And so that's why it's important not to put yourself out there in public like that, because that's what the political world does. Think about it. All the people that ran for president and got knocked out of the election because of something they said 10 years ago or 20 years ago, and they're being held, they're having their hands held to the fire over a comment they made, back in 1985, for instance, or whatever the time frame was, and the whole world is judging them based on something they said a long time ago or did a long time ago, not realizing that they've grown since then, especially if they're relatively successful people. They're going to get around other people that influence their decisions and things, and they're going to read books like Psycho-Cybernetics, and they're going to change their worldview, and of course they're going to have different opinions on things than they had 10 years ago or 12 years ago or 15 or 25 years ago. And that's the important thing to remember, is people don't forget. We should forgive and forget, but often we don't. We claim to forgive people, we claim to forget things, but actually it's still back there, and all it takes is one false step from somebody for them to rehash that and bring it all back up again. And that's why doing this reading is so crucial. And if you're looking to really improve your life, this is a great book to start with. And as I was going to tell you, the page length of this, it's a little bit thicker book. It's 268 pages. That's the original book. And again, his name is Maxwell Maltz, MD-FICS. I forget what FICS means, but doctors, of course, what MD means. It's a great book, and if you really want to learn some of the mistakes and key mistakes you've been making, and I promise you're still making, this is a great book to read and pick up and find out, wow, he's talking about me. So I don't know if that's ever happened to you, but I'll tell you what, as I read these books, I swear that the author a lot of times has been following me around and taking notes on how I live my life, and going, wow, this guy's making all kinds of mistakes. I need to write this down. By the way, that might not be a bad way to figure out a topic for your next book, is to follow around either a very successful person and that you have regular access to. It could be a parent, a relative, a friend, a coworker, or whatever, and just talk to them. And as they give you thoughts on their success, write it down and turn it into some of your thoughts on it, and how maybe how you haven't been doing these things. You could be doing the same thing in reverse, and maybe you have somebody in that realm that's been a failure in a lot of things, and follow that person around and just write down all their mistakes that they make, and the habits that you can kind of see why they're making these mistakes and repeating them, and you can turn that into a book very easily. So anyway, those are just some bonus suggestions there. That's all I've got for you today. If you enjoyed today's podcast, be sure to like it on Facebook and share it with some friends and family that might benefit from it. And let me know what your thoughts on it. If I've helped you at all, I'd love to know how I helped and what you got out of this podcast. I'll talk to you next week.
That's all for this week. Tune in next week for another episode of Success Weekly. Do you have an idea you'd like James to talk about in an upcoming episode? Post your comments and be sure to share this podcast with friends.